Welcome to Copilot Podcasts. America is under fire, not from foreign armies, not from missiles or tanks, but from ideas. That's the opening salvo of a book that landed on July 4th, 2026, written by a U.S. Marine who also happens to be a minister, a martial arts master, and an educator. Today, we're unpacking Under Fire, a U.S. Marine stand against democratic socialism and neo-communism by Charles E. Smoot. By the end of this episode, you'll understand exactly what argument Smoot is making, why he frames this as a spiritual battle and not just a political one, and what the book is actually asking its readers to do. I've got someone here who's dug deep into this book and its themes, so let's get into it. What's the first thing someone needs to know about who Charles Smoot actually is?
So Charles E. Smoot is not your typical political commentator. The page content describes him as a U.S. Marine veteran, a minister, an educator, and a martial arts instructor with more than 5 decades of experience in leadership, personal defense, and biblical teaching.
5 decades. That's a long time.
It really is. And what's striking is how many different identities he's holding at once. He's a certified firearms instructor, a 7th degree black belt, and the founder of something called the Wudokwan Institute of Combat Arts. So you've got this person who is simultaneously thinking about physical defense and spiritual defense.
That's a wild combination. Like, he's teaching people how to throw a punch and also how to read scripture.
Right, and I think that combination is actually central to understanding the book, because Smoot isn't approaching this as a detached academic. He's the founder of what he calls the Under Fire movement, which, according to the page content, is dedicated to equipping ordinary Americans to stand firm in faith, freedom, and personal responsibility during times of cultural and political uncertainty.
So it's a movement, not just a book.
Exactly. The book is almost like the manifesto for that movement. And the timing is deliberate. It was published on July 4th, 2026 by Under Fire Media Group. Independence Day. That's not an accident.
Oh, that's a very intentional choice. Publishing on the 4th of July sends a message before you even open the cover.
Completely. And the book itself is 342 pages, categorized on Amazon under politics and social sciences, specifically conservatism and liberalism. It's currently ranked number 2,969 in communism and socialism books on Amazon.
So it's sitting right in the middle of the very category it's arguing against. That's kind of poetic.
Ha, yeah, it really is. And Smoot has written other books too. The page content mentions Unleashing the Power of Prayer and Fasting, Fallen from Grace, and other works focused on faith, leadership, preparedness, and personal responsibility. So this isn't a one-off. He's been building this body of work.
So he's got a whole ecosystem of ideas here. Let's get into the actual content of the book then. What is Smoot's central argument?
The central argument, as laid out in the book's description, is that America is under fire, and the threat isn't military, it's ideological. Smoot says the danger comes from what he calls dangerous ideas that threaten faith, freedom, family, and the foundations of the nation.
And those dangerous ideas are specifically socialism, communism, and Marxism.
Exactly. And he approaches this from 3 distinct angles simultaneously: historical, political, and spiritual. He draws on his experience as a Marine, a Christian minister, an educator, and what the page content calls a lifelong student of history and scripture.
So it's not just socialism bad, he's actually trying to build a layered case.
Right, and the first layer is historical. The book promises to cover the historical origins of socialism and communism and their, quote, devastating impact around the world. So he's grounding the argument in what he sees as a track record of failure.
That's a pretty standard conservative argument. Point to the Soviet Union, point to Venezuela, point to historical examples of communist regimes.
It is, and that's where the book's second layer becomes more distinctive. Because Smoot doesn't stop at history, he goes into what he calls the spiritual dangers of these ideologies. The page content specifically says he argues that Marxist ideology is fundamentally incompatible with biblical Christianity.
Okay, that's a bolder claim. Walk me through that.
So the argument, as described in the book's summary, is that faith, freedom, and personal responsibility are inseparably linked. And if you have a system that centralizes power in the government and removes individual agency, you're essentially cutting people off from what Smoot sees as a God-given framework for living.
And he's not just talking about government policy here. The page content says he's looking at how these ideas have influenced culture, education, government, and even some churches.
Yes, and that even some churches part is significant. He's essentially saying the ideological influence has penetrated institutions that are supposed to be the bulwark against it. That's a pretty provocative claim to make to a Christian audience.
It's almost like he's saying the enemy is already inside the gates.
That's exactly the framing. And it connects to one of the book's most philosophically loaded distinctions, which is the difference between what Smoot calls biblical compassion and government-enforced redistribution.
Okay, I want to sit with that for a second, because on the surface, both of those things involve helping people who have less. So what's the actual distinction he's drawing?
The distinction, as the book frames it, is about agency and motive. Biblical compassion, in Smoot's view, is voluntary. It comes from a person choosing to give, to serve, to help. Government-enforced redistribution removes that choice. And for Smoot, that removal of choice is where the spiritual problem begins.
So it's not just about the outcome, it's about who's making the decision and why.
Exactly. And that's actually a pretty old theological argument, the idea that virtue requires free will. You can't be genuinely generous if you're compelled to give. Smoot is essentially applying that framework to economic policy.
That's interesting because it reframes the whole debate. It's not do we help the poor, it's who gets to decide how and whether we help the poor.
Right. And critics of that position would say, well, voluntary charity hasn't solved poverty, so maybe compulsion is necessary. But Smoot's counter would be that the spiritual cost of that compulsion is too high.
That's a real tension in the book's argument, and I think it's worth naming that tension rather than glossing over it.
Absolutely. And the book doesn't pretend the tension doesn't exist, it's framing it as a battle. The page content literally uses the phrase, the war of ideas is real. This is not a book that's trying to find common ground.
Which brings us to who the book is actually written for, because the page content is pretty specific about the target audience.
Very specific. The book says it offers practical guidance for Christians, parents, pastors, and patriots. Those are the four groups Smoot is explicitly addressing. And the page content says it will equip and encourage them for what it calls the battle ahead.
So it's not trying to convert skeptics, it's trying to arm believers.
That's a really precise way to put it. The page content even uses the phrase spiritual weapons for confronting deception and defending truth. So the metaphor of combat runs all the way through, which makes sense given Smoot's background.
A Marine who teaches martial arts writing a book about spiritual warfare. The metaphor is completely consistent with who he is.
And his motto, which appears in his author bio on the page, is faith and freedom rise or fall together. That's the thesis in 6 words.
That's a punchy line. And it does capture the core of what he's arguing, that you can't separate political liberty from religious conviction.
Which is a position with a long history in American political thought, going back to the founders. But it's also a position that a lot of people would push back on, the idea that secular freedom and religious faith are necessarily linked.
Right, because plenty of people would argue you can have a free society without a religious foundation. That's kind of the whole Enlightenment project.
And Smoot would probably say that's exactly the problem, that the Enlightenment's separation of faith from public life is what opened the door to the ideologies he's critiquing. It's a coherent argument, even if you disagree with it.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the idea that socialist and communist ideas have influenced some churches, because that feels like the most controversial claim in the book.
It's definitely the most internally provocative one, because Smoot is essentially telling his own audience, the Christian community, that the threat has already infiltrated their own institutions. He's not just pointing outward at secular culture, he's pointing inward.
And that's a harder message to deliver. It's one thing to say the government is going in the wrong direction. It's another to say your church might be compromised.
Exactly. And the page content frames the book as more than a political analysis. It calls it a call to courage, conviction, and action. So Smoot is asking readers to do something uncomfortable, which is to examine the institutions they trust.
That's actually a pretty demanding ask. Most political books tell you the other side is wrong. This one is also asking you to look at your own side.
And the book's challenge, as described in the page content, is to think biblically, evaluate ideas through the lens of Scripture, and stand boldly for truth in a time of growing confusion. So the methodology he's offering is Scripture as the filter for evaluating everything, including what happens in your own church.
Which is a very specific epistemological framework. You're not using data or polling or economic models. You're using Scripture.
Right. And for his audience, that's not a limitation. That's the point. The page content says he's a lifelong student of history and Scripture, and he's drawing on both. But Scripture is the ultimate authority in his framework.
Let's talk about the broader context for a second. The Amazon page shows what other books are being recommended alongside this one, and it's a pretty revealing list.
It really is. You've got The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn sitting right there, which is one of the most devastating first-hand accounts of Soviet communist repression ever written. You've also got The Communist Manifesto and Socialism 101 in the same recommendation cluster.
So Amazon is essentially saying, if you're interested in this debate, here are the primary sources on both sides.
Which is kind of fascinating. Smoot's book is being algorithmically grouped with the very text he's critiquing. Solzhenitsyn would probably be the one he'd most align with, someone who lived under Soviet communism and wrote about its horrors from the inside.
And Solzhenitsyn was also deeply Christian. He saw the Soviet system as fundamentally anti-spiritual, not just anti-political. So there's a real intellectual lineage there.
Absolutely. And that lineage matters for understanding what Smoot is doing. He's not inventing this argument, he's placing himself in a tradition of Christian anti-communist thought that goes back decades.
Now, the book has 0 customer reviews on Amazon at this point. It was published July 4th, 2026, so it's brand new. But what does the framing of the book tell us about what kind of reception it's likely to get?
Well, the framing is unapologetically partisan. This is not a book that's trying to persuade people who disagree with Smoot. The page content says it's for people who are concerned about the future of America, seeking a biblical understanding of current cultural issues, or looking for practical guidance on defending faith and freedom. That's a self-selecting audience.
So it's preaching to the choir, in a sense.
In terms of its primary audience, yes, but I'd push back slightly on the preaching to the choir framing, because the book is also trying to do something more active than just affirm existing beliefs. It's trying to equip people, give them arguments, give them a framework, give them what it calls spiritual weapons.
So it's less you're right and more here's how to defend what you believe.
Exactly. And that's a different kind of book. It's closer to a training manual than a persuasion piece, which again tracks with Smoot's background. He's a Marine, a martial arts instructor, a firearms instructor. He thinks in terms of preparation and defense.
That's a really useful lens for understanding the book's purpose. It's not trying to win a debate. It's trying to prepare people for one.
And the page content ends with this line: "The war of ideas is real. The stakes are high. The time to stand is now." That's not the language of academic discourse. That's a call to arms.
Which raises a real question about tone, because that kind of urgent, battle-ready language can be galvanizing for people who already agree, but it can also make it harder to reach people who are on the fence.
That's a fair critique. And it's worth noting that Smoot seems aware of this. The page content says the book challenges readers to think critically. So there's at least an aspiration toward intellectual engagement, not just emotional mobilization.
Though thinking critically through the lens of scripture is still a very specific kind of critical thinking.
True. And that's the fundamental tension in the book's project. It's asking people to use reason and evidence, but within a framework that has a predetermined ultimate authority. For people inside that framework, that's not a contradiction. For people outside it, it is.
And that's probably why the book is unlikely to change many minds outside its target audience. But within that audience, it could be genuinely influential.
Especially because Smoot has credibility that a lot of political commentators don't. He's not a pundit or a politician. He's a veteran, a minister, an educator, a martial arts master. He's lived the values he's writing about.
And he's been doing this for more than 5 decades. That's not someone who just discovered these ideas last election cycle.
Right. And his author bio says he continues to write, teach, speak, and encourage believers across America. So the book is part of an ongoing mission, not a one-time statement.
So when you step back from all of this, the book, the author, the arguments, the framing, what does it really come down to?
It comes down to a very old question that's getting asked with new urgency. What is the relationship between faith and political order? Smoot's answer is that they're inseparable, that you can't have genuine freedom without a moral and spiritual foundation, and that ideologies like socialism and Marxism undermine both.
And his argument is that this isn't just a political debate, it's a spiritual one. Which is why he's not just writing a policy book, he's writing what the page content calls more than a political analysis.
Exactly. And the practical dimension of the book is important too. It's not just diagnosing the problem, it's offering what the page content describes as practical guidance for Christians, parents, pastors, and patriots. It's trying to be actionable.
Which is actually what separates a lot of good political books from mediocre ones. Anyone can tell you what's wrong. Fewer people can tell you what to do about it.
And Smoot's background gives him a particular kind of authority to speak to that practical dimension. He's not just a theorist, he's someone who has spent decades training people, physically, spiritually, intellectually.
Here's what I keep coming back to, though. The book's title uses the phrase Neo-Communism. That's a specific and loaded term. What does that framing signal?
It signals that Smoot sees modern progressive politics not as something new, but as a continuation or evolution of older Marxist ideas. The neo prefix is doing a lot of work. It's saying these aren't just liberal policy preferences, they're ideologically rooted in a tradition with a specific and, in his view, dangerous history.
Which is a framing that a lot of people on the left would strongly reject. They'd say democratic socialism is fundamentally different from Soviet-style communism.
And that's exactly the debate the book is entering. Smoot's position, based on the page content, is that the ideological roots are the same, even if the methods differ. The historical origins he traces are meant to show that continuity.
So the book is essentially arguing that the label matters, that calling something democratic socialism doesn't change what it is at its core.
That's the argument. And it's a provocative one because it refuses to accept the distinctions that proponents of democratic socialism would draw. For Smoot, the family resemblance is too strong to ignore.
All right, so here's what this really comes down to. Under Fire is a book that's doing several things at once. It's a historical argument, a theological argument, and a practical guide, all wrapped in the voice of someone who has spent his entire life in service and defense.
And the through line connecting all of it is that motto, faith and freedom rise or fall together. Whether you agree with Smoot or not, that's a coherent and deeply held conviction, and the book is built entirely around it.
And the book is asking its readers to do something specific, not just to nod along, but to think biblically, to evaluate ideas through scripture, and to stand boldly. It's a call to active engagement, not passive agreement.
Which is consistent with everything Smoot has built, the Under Fire movement, the Martial Arts Institute, the ministry. He's not interested in spectators, he's training participants.
And that's actually the most interesting thing about this book to me. In a media landscape full of people telling you what to think, Smoot is telling you how to fight for what you already believe. That's a different kind of book.
And whether you're in his corner or not, that distinction is worth understanding. Because the people reading this book aren't going to put it down and forget about it. They're going to do something with it.
We started this episode with the idea that America is under fire, not from armies, but from ideas. And what Smoot is saying in 342 pages published on the 4th of July is that the response to dangerous ideas isn't silence or retreat. It's engagement. It's standing firm. It's what he calls the time to stand is now.
And for the audience he's writing for, that message is going to land hard. Because it's not abstract, it's personal. It's coming from someone who has spent more than 5 decades living exactly what he's preaching.
A Marine, a minister, a martial arts master, and now an author, all saying the same thing in different languages. That's a pretty unified message. Thanks for breaking this down with me today, and thanks to everyone listening to Copilot podcasts. The war of ideas is real, and now you know a little more about one soldier who's decided to fight it with a pen.
America. We are under fire, not from foreign enemies, but from within. But how is this happening right before our eyes, in our schools, in our media, inside our churches and government? Neo-Marxist ideology and critical theories are reshaping how we think and live. When truth is rewritten, when faith is weakened, and when power goes unchecked, nations begin to fall. During the Cold War, I served as a United States Marine, but my mission to defend truth and freedom didn't end there, because the greatest threat to America is not on a distant battlefield. It's already entrenched within our institutions, and we are under fire. Understand the battle before it's too late.